Hi everyone, hello. My name is Wayne Tufek, as you've just heard. Thanks for taking the time out today to come and listen to my presentation. Now, supplier risk management, third-party risk management, supply chain risk management are all terms used to describe a process to identify, to manage, to assess, and to monitor the risk presented by using third parties. So it's a set of activities that you would do to manage your risk. Now, when you enter into a third-party relationship, you're exposing your organization to additional vulnerabilities because you're increasing your attack surface of your organization. Now, using third parties is something that a lot of organizations are doing, obviously, because a third party can provide a good or a service a lot more effectively, a cheaper cost than what can be done in-house. So a lot of organizations outsource so that they can focus more on things that they consider core activities that are going to differentiate them in the market. When you're using a third party, you're either, for example, giving them access to your internal systems, or you might be giving them copies of your confidential information that they're going to store inside their system or their data center, like a SaaS application. Or they're providing some type of service that forms part of your critical business activity. So if there's a disruption in their organization, then that could have an adverse impact on yours. Or more often than not, it's actually a combination of all three of those types of instances. If you look at a lot of the data breaches in history, attackers will take the shortest and easiest path in order to reach their objectives, and often that is through a third party, because a third party will have a lower level of security than what the primary target has. So whilst you can outsource the provision of a good or a service, what you cannot do is outsource accountability for risk. So if something happens in the third party, if there's a data breach, then your organization will remain accountable, and your customers are doing business with you, not with the third party. So their expectations are that you will take care of their information. So increasingly, organizations only look at performance metrics and KPIs when they're outsourcing, and there's often a little attention to the actual risks and exposures that the relationship will create. And there's a significant cost to maintaining an adequate third-party risk management program in terms of the people and the resources required to undertake the activities if you want to manage your risk to an acceptable level. So what's going to happen in the future, I think, is that organizations will need to weigh up the benefits that they're getting from the third-party relationship versus the costs of implementing a proper program to manage those risks. So my presentation today is basically about the set of activities and the steps and the procedures that you can use in order to manage your third-party risk. Now today, to talk about some breaches in the past, so you get a feel for, I guess, what's the worst that can happen. Talk about some compliance frameworks and the law. So what guidance do we have around how third-party risk should be managed? I'm going to talk about the major failings. So when I go in an organization, have a look at their existing third-party risk management process, what are the things that come out the most as being done poorly or not being done well enough? I'm going to outline a 5-step process that you can follow or you can implement, or you can have a look at what you're doing now and change it. Touch on some metrics that you can use. So once you do implement a process, what you need to do is obviously report to management about how well or how not so well the process is going. Some resources that are available on the internet, some free and some paid, that you can use. Some next steps, what I think you should do moving on from today, some final thoughts, and there will maybe be some time for questions at the end. Very quick introduction to what actually is a third-party risk. So if you have a company, for instance, generic company ABC, you might outsource the provision of some goods or services to other organizations. Just a quick show of hands, whose company actually does use third parties in the provision? Pretty much everyone, okay. And that's all well and fine, but third-party risk then can generate some fourth-party risk. So they're third parties to your fourth parties. And effectively what we have is quite a large ecosystem, a spiraling ecosystem, a spiraling creation of risk, of vulnerabilities, of increasing your organization's attack surface as each of these third parties use fourth parties and fourth parties use fifth parties. So quickly, what type of risk are we talking about? We're talking about operational risk. So some type of disruption within the third party may impact your organization's ability to provide services to your customers, impacting your financials, or providing a reputational damage in the case of a data breach of the third party, but also compliance risk. So is the third party that you're contracted with, are they following the laws and regulations as they should be? So what's the worst that can happen? No discussion about third-party risk is going to be complete without talking about target. So back in December 2013, right before Christmas, the news about a data breach at Target broke, not from Target themselves, but from Brian Krebs. So he actually posted something in his blog and revealed that Target had known about a breach for the last few weeks and had been investigating, but hadn't told anyone. Now, the beginning of the Target breach actually occurred because there was a security breakdown in one of their contractors, Fazio Mechanical Services, who actually looked after the heating and cooling systems in Target stores. So the attackers had placed some malware on a Fazio machine, they collected some credentials, and they used those credentials to access the Target network, an Ariba system that contractors would use when they completed the job so that they would get paid. And then from there, they were able to jump from this particular system straight to the area where the POS terminals were, load malware onto the POS terminals and pull out some 40 million credit and debit card numbers. And from there, they're also able to get 70 million records of people's names, addresses, in email addresses as well. So we know a lot about the Target breach because it was widely publicised, and Target actually had to go to in front up to a US Senate committee and explain where they had fallen down. So the output of the Target breach was that the CEO resigned, the CIO resigned, and they're still paying fines up over $250 million and increasing. Similarly, Home Depot, another retailer, they had a breach in September 2014. What we know about this one is that Home Depot, in a press statement, actually said that the credentials of a third party were compromised. There were no more details. This one wasn't quite as widely reported. Last year, on June the 27th, users of a Ukrainian accounting package called Medoc got a little bit of an extra surprise in their daily update or weekly update of accounting software, in that they were infected with the NotPetya virus. So some Russian hackers had figured out how to proxy the Medoc update service to their own servers. So whenever the Medoc updates were going out, they were actually pushing out the NotPetya malware. So that particular incident probably doesn't need much explanation, but global companies like FedEx suffered $400 million, I think, worth of loss. The pharmaceutical giant Merck, 375, and Moller-Maersk, the global shipping company, around $300 million worth of damage. A little bit closer to home, we're talking about the Australian Red Cross Blood Service. So September the 5th, I think it was 2015, their service provider, Precedent IT, who was in charge of running their appointment booking system, so people could make appointments when they wanted to go and give blood. One of their people at Precedent Communications had copied the backup of the production database to a UAT server and left that backup sitting there on a world-readable web server. On the 25th of October, a researcher found it, alerted a few people. AusCERT was actually involved in helping them with the breach. And then what came to light was that there was the database was full of 550,000 records of people who had made appointments to give blood. A lot of really sensitive personal information like name, address, date of birth, medical history around drug use, and other types of things that you don't want to get out. There's an example of a human error or a mistake in a third party that's impacted the Red Cross Blood Service. Mossack Fonseca happened in April, I think, 2014. Mossack Fonseca was an offshore tax haven organisation that provided advice to a lot of prominent individuals and politicians, such as David Cameron from the UK and Iceland's Prime Minister. So about 10 gigabytes worth of information about their personal tax affairs were made firstly public by journalists around the world, and that information was then basically available for anyone. And last but not least, Kaspersky has had a lot of bad press. The American and UK governments have banned the use of Kaspersky in government organisations. The story goes that an NSA contractor or an NSA employee, he had taken some secret NSA tools with him, taken them home, had them on his home computer, which he was also running actually Kaspersky. So the allegation goes that Kaspersky had, the antivirus software had identified these files as being interesting and shipped them back to Russia. And through Kaspersky's connections with the Russian government, the tools found their way into a state-sponsored group of Russian hackers called the Shadow Brokers. And if you follow that story, the Shadow Brokers had the NSA tools up for auction, which they later gave away for free. And one of those tools was Eternal Blue, which was the main exploit used for WannaCry and NotPetya. So if we have a look at the compliance frameworks and some of the laws, what guidance do we get from them? ISO 27001 has a section on supplier relationships, talking about how to manage and monitor suppliers. The Privacy Act, we're talking about APP 11, taking reasonable measures to protect personal information from misuse, interference or loss, unauthorised access, modification or disclosure. It's a little excerpt there from the Red Cross Blood Service investigation. Basically what the Commissioner is saying is that you cannot outsource your privacy obligations. You must put in place reasonable measures to ensure their third-party providers' compliance with appropriate privacy and data security practices and procedures. PCI, of course, the Credit Card Data Security Standard, has a whole section there on third-party security assurance, a whole quite useful document. And then the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, which was recently updated from version 1 to 1.1 at RSA this year, actually now has 5 controls around supply chain risk management. And that's what I'm going to have a closer look at today. A lot of organisations think that third-party risk management starts with just looking at your third parties, but no, it doesn't. It starts with implementing a lot of good, better practices in your own organisation first. Of course, network segmentation, you want to obviously hive off the systems that the third parties will be accessing from anything important, an important lesson that Target learned. Similarly, remote access, how are you allowing remote access? Using some type of VPN. Of course, multi-factor authentication for anything that's publicly available should be a no-brainer. A good form of endpoint security, so move away from signature-based antivirus to something that uses machine learning and artificial intelligence. Least privilege, basic security principle, only as much access as you needed. Privileged access management, how are you monitoring those providers that have full access to your IT environment and your IT systems? So what do you have in place within your organisation to actually audit and log and control what they're doing? Vulnerability management and patching, a no-brainer. Some build standards, some configuration standards for how you create systems and set them up. And then a very important lesson from Target is to tune your detection systems and not get overloaded by alerts. Easier said than done, but Target was actually alerted that malware had been deployed to their POS systems, but had too many alerts and basically ignored them. So when I look at third-party risk management processes, there's a number of failings or key shortfalls. One of those is visibility. A lot of organisations have no idea of the third parties outside their organisation that they're using. So what type of information they've given the third party and the third party's level of security. Similarly, with third parties that are accessing your particular organisation or your environment, often the organisation doesn't have an idea of who they are, what access they have, what they have access to, or even what they're actually there to do. There's a lack of stratification. What I mean by that is not all third parties are created equal. So third-party risk management takes a lot of time, a lot of resources, and a lot of effort. And you need to be able to focus those resources and effort which is limited to only those third parties that present the highest level of risk. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Criticality. A lot of third parties, there needs to be a way to assess how critical the third party's relationship is to your particular organisation. And I'll touch on that shortly. A lack of governance process and accountability. Often there's no ownership of third-party risk management within your organisation. There's no executive support. There's no process. So people don't often know what they're meant to do. More often than not, I'm surprised at the number of times I've had somebody come up to my desk or send me an email and say, we've just signed up company A, we've just signed the contract, can you go and check and make sure that they're okay? By then it's too late. So you've really got to get the message out there up front. Go and speak to the heads of different business units. Tell them that this is how third-party risk management needs to be done. You need to do your due diligence before you sign any contract. There's often a lack of tools. So third-party risk management often done using emails and spreadsheets. Hand up anyone who's still using emails and spreadsheets for third-party risk management. Okay, a couple of you, but not too many. There are tools out there that automate the process. They're going to make it a lot easier, a lot more efficient, a lot more effective. Often it's treated as a one-off event. So you'll perform a third-party risk assessment on somebody that's an organisation that you just signed up, and then you never go back and check, never go back and monitor, and never do it again. An over-reliance on contracts. So contracts are very important. I'll touch on that, the key clauses that you should have in a particular contract, but you cannot rely simply on a contract. You must verify that the third party is actually doing what they're contracted to do. Similarly, ineffective and incomplete contracts won't help you either, so there are some key clauses that you must include within a contract. Having said that, your organisation's ability to include particular clauses in a contract obviously depends on how big you are and how much weight you have. If you're dealing with companies like Amazon or AWS, then your ability to negotiate is limited unless you're the same size as them. And there's often a lack of oversight, as I said before, so accountability for the particular functions that need to occur. So this is the process that I recommend that you follow. Take what you want. Don't take what you don't want. If you see anything that you think is good, then please, by all means, you can use that. But basically, it's a 5-step process, beginning with planning and governance. So having a policy in place, having an idea of who's responsible, who's accountable, who's consultant, who's informed in terms of a RACI, having a documented process, having the key players within your organisation aware of what that process is. Due diligence and selection is how you go about assessing the level of risk that your organisation is exposed to by using the third party. As I said before, this should happen before any contracts are signed, because your ability to negotiate once you have signed a contract is obviously decreased. Contracts, very, very important. The contract outlines the obligations of the third party and what your expectations of them are. Ongoing monitoring and checking. One of the major failings is that third-party risk management is a one-off event. You want to make sure that you're, where it's warranted, constantly monitoring and checking the third parties that represent the highest risk to your organisation. And then lastly, termination. Often it's good to start these types of things with the end in mind. So how can you terminate the contract for non-performance? What will happen if the contract is terminated in terms of getting your data back? What format will it come in? What assurances do you have that the third party securely deleted the information? And how easy is it for your organisation to either bring whatever the third party is doing back in-house or transfer to another third party? Are all things that you need to think about. So planning and governance. We're talking about management oversight. We're talking about a policy and we're talking about a process. So have something that's documented, have people aware of their roles and their responsibilities. So create that awareness. It's very, very important that people understand what they're meant to be doing. In my experience, the marketing department is often the worst department in your organisation, because they'll take a credit card, they'll sign up to a SaaS application, and they'll provide the provider with a complete extract of your customer database without doing any checking. So create that awareness. Create an inventory or a map of the third parties that you're sharing information with, what types of information you're sharing with them, and what functions they're actually providing. So have that in a document. And start requesting some reports. A good report to request is from whoever's responsible for setting up vendors in your organisation. Get a report from them once a month that says vendor A, B and C, these are the ones we've signed up. It's a good way for you to check, just in case anything slips through the cracks. This particular step fits in well with the NIST cybersecurity framework, the control there. Cyber supply chain risk management processes are identified, established, assessed, managed and agreed to by organisational stakeholders. Due diligence and selection. So, as I said before, the resources are limited, time is limited. So what you basically need to do is some way of allocating different third parties into different buckets so that you can then apply different levels of checking, different levels of rigour in order to manage your risk. So what I like to use in order to assess the third party is use an axis. On one, the vertical axis is the value of the data. So how important is that information? And then set that against the value of the business process or the activity that the third party is performing for you. So if you're giving a third party high value data and they're conducting a very important or critical business process, then you put them in the high risk bucket. So how many buckets you have is up to you. What types of procedures you perform for vendors in different buckets we'll touch on shortly. So this gives you risk-based segmentation so that you can focus your efforts on the higher risk vendors. Rules-based due diligence is when you've stratified your vendors into different buckets, then you apply different procedures based on the level of risk. So obviously higher risk third parties have more detailed, more thorough procedures performed against them. Often the due diligence is based on a questionnaire. There are a lot of good questionnaires that you can find on the internet. These are free. So the Cloud Security Alliance has a very comprehensive and detailed questionnaire, as the name suggests, for cloud service providers, but you can quite easily change that for a non-cloud service provider. Shared assessments have a questionnaire as well, but they're a paid organisation. But then there's a Vendor Security Alliance which have a free questionnaire as well. All good material. If you don't want to use that, then you can always come up with your own. Automation is key in terms of this particular component or stage of the process, in that you don't want to be relying on emails and spreadsheets because you will get lost. There'll be too many, you won't be able to keep track of where you're at, where the responses are, who you've been speaking with. Find a system that will allow you to automate that. When you've done your due diligence, you're going to come up with a whole list of, potentially, a list of remediation items, and these are control deficiencies that you've identified within the third party. Have a process to track those. And we'll touch a little bit on contracts, but you also need to have some contractual clauses where the third party will actually remediate the weaknesses that you have found as part of your due diligence. It's also very important to understand the fourth parties, because often if you're outsourcing to a third party, say you had a lot of third parties that are using something in AWS, so they're all using Salesforce, you can then identify common service providers that, if there's an outage in that service provider, is going to have ramifications for your supply chain. So have a think about that. Understand the fourth parties that your third parties are using, particularly when they're some type of IT service such as, say, Azure, AWS, or a DNS service provider, for instance, that they're all using, common ones. In terms of your due diligence and selection, it's basically up to you to come up with the procedures that you're going to exercise whenever you are checking high risk versus medium risk versus low risk. High risk vendors, I would recommend a 6-monthly assessment or as determined by residual risk. So you might have a high risk, what looks like initially a high risk vendor, but if they're on top of everything and they can prove that, then obviously you don't need to check them as much as you would a different vendor. Highly recommend an on-site assessment. It's more time consuming and more costly, but gives you a better feel for the controls within the third party. A review of their certifications, so things like ISO 27001, service organization controls or SOC reports, things like PCI DSS certification are all very important, and a review of any third-party assessments. So often the third party will provide you with some pen testing reports that they've commissioned or some other report from a third party as proof that they have the right controls in place. Medium risk should probably be done once a year or as determined by the level of risk. A remote questionnaire is what I find useful in that situation. That's where you simply send them a survey to complete. They answer the questions, upload their documents as evidence. Again, review of certifications and a review of third-party assessments. Low-risk vendors, ongoing monitoring is important. A one-time assessment in the form of a remote questionnaire, and of course a review of any certifications or third-party assessments they might have. This particular step basically lines up with the objective from NIST. Suppliers and third-party partners of information systems, components and services are identified, prioritised and assessed using a cyber supply chain risk assessment process. Contracts, very, very important. You need to get your legal team on side. Make sure they're aware of these types of things to include within the contract. The contract itself, as I said before, outlines the responsibilities of the third party and is quite important to the relationship. Your organisation's ability to negotiate the contract, of course, will depend on the size of your company and the size of the business. But you need things like performance metrics. How will you measure the third party's performance? Data protection systems and processes. So what controls do the third party have? You should actually stipulate the controls that the third party has what types of systems they should in place, and what types of measures they should have. Now, there are a lot of good free guides available on the internet that you can use as guidance. For instance, Oracle has quite a comprehensive third-party supplier list of controls. A lot of the banks put them up on the web. JP Morgan has one as well, so you can use that as guidance. Contracts must be kept up to date. So often when you're signing a multi-year contract, you don't want to be locked into that contract, locked into the same controls. With a continually changing threat landscape, you want to be able to have some options to be able to change that contract should something happen, or should the threat landscape change. Breach notification and a breach action plan, very, very important now that we have mandatory data breach reporting in Australia. So if there is a breach at a third party, how are they going to handle that breach? What steps are they going to take? Are they going to inform you? How will the communication occur between them and you? Who's going to inform anyone whose information has been lost or misused or stolen? So how will the communications handle? Who's going to notify the OAIC? Data ownership is important, so who actually owns the information? It might be your information, but you need to stipulate that in the contract. Typical legal clauses around indemnity and negligence or omission should always be included. The steps for termination, so what's going to happen when the contract ends? Will your data be returned to you? If so, in what format will that data be returned? If the third party is using some type of proprietary database and they give the information to you in that format, are you going to be able to put that into your own system? Are you going to be able to move it to another third party, for instance? And what actions are they going to take in order to delete the information securely, and what assurances will they give you that that information has actually been securely deleted? Of course, sharing with other parties. So if you do contract with the third party, you need to stipulate in a contract that they're not allowed to share your information with anybody else unless you provide them with written approval. And they should also have some form of cyber insurance, just to protect themselves, so that they can then be able to either get the assistance they need in the event of a breach, and also cover any of the costs. A very important clause is the right to access and audit. So you must have the right to get access to particular documents, the right to get access to people. Often you can also ask for the right to perform testing, be that some type of external penetration testing or some type of internal testing. Again, your ability to insert this type of clause in the contract depends on how big your organisation is. Disaster recovery and business continuity are critical in terms of understanding whether the third party has a plan, whether they've tested their plan. If they have a plan and they've tested it, then have a look at their the timeframes with which they can bring the system back up, and the amount of data that's lost. Typically, the RTO and RPO recovery. I've forgotten RTO and RPOs. Yeah, the time objective. Yeah. And have a look and see whether they fit into your particular organisation's timeframe. So if you've done a business impact assessment, you understand what your own RTO and RPO is. Does the third party, can they meet your RTOs and RPOs? Maintenance of certification. So if you've signed up a third party and they have ISO 27001, then put a requirement in there for them to maintain that particular certification over the life of the contract. Regular independent tests, either performed by yourself or semi-independent tests where the third party commissions a pen testing firm to come in and do an assessment. Of course, backups are very, very important. So have some type of understanding with them about how often the backups will be taken and where the backups will be stored. If you're really quite risk averse, then ensure that you're receiving backups from the third party to your own systems at some stage. But that's only really for risk-averse organisations. Data sovereignty is very, very important as well. So where will the data go? Which countries will it be in? This is quite important for those organisations using third parties with cloud systems, because they can move data between regions quite easily. And last but not least, access to internal audit reports and the ability to track the status of remediation activities in the third party where you identify some type of risk or exposure. This particular section deals with the supply chain risk, Objective 3 in NIST. Contracts with suppliers and third-party partners are used to implement appropriate measures designed to meet the objectives of an organisation's cybersecurity program and cyber supply chain risk management plan. Ongoing monitoring and checking. As I said before, one of the major failings of third-party risk management is it's just a one-off event. Over the life of the contract, you do need to keep checking, keep monitoring, and hopefully auditing the third party to understand whether your risk exposures have changed or not from your initial assessment. Ensure that your contract allows you to perform ongoing monitoring and checking. Ensure that allows you to follow up on remediation items. So if you do identify control weaknesses, are they actually addressing them? Are they addressing them properly? And do you have any proof that they've actually implemented something that works in terms of control design and control effectiveness? Ongoing checking of certifications, ISO or SOC. When you're looking at SOC reports, make sure you get a Type 2 report. Type 2 reports include not only assessment of the design, but also testing of the effectiveness of the control, whereas a SOC one is just looking at design. Penetration testing reports, audit reports, and perhaps your own testing are all things that you need to be doing at regular stages. This particular step deals with risk 4 and risk 5 around routine assessment using audits and test results, and also looking at the response and recovery planning and testing conducted by suppliers. So make sure they have a plan and they've tested it in terms of recovery. We're talking about termination. We're talking about planning with the end in mind, unfortunately. So how will you get your data back? What format will it be in? How will it be securely deleted? Ensuring that you have the right contractual provisions to enforce that is important. Once you have a process in place and you have a bit of a third-party risk management program, you should be reporting metrics. For instance, some of the things that you can think about in terms of metrics are the number of high-risk third parties that have not been assessed by their due date. So when you put them in the different buckets and you figure out how often they'll be checked, you should be measuring whether you're actually meeting that target. Which third parties do not have adequate controls in place? So you've gone through, you've assessed your 10 high-risk vendors and 3 don't have adequate controls. Once you've identified any weaknesses or remediation items, other third parties, are they tracking to meeting those, to fixing those items? So have they fixed them by the due date? Have they provided evidence that they've fixed them properly? Some resources that you can find on the internet. A particularly good one that I only found last week is called the Third Party Playbook. This is from a US company that actually did a study at a lot of large organizations in the US about how they handle third-party risk management. So it's quite a good comprehensive guide to the various steps in the processes and the types of controls that you should have. Cloud Security Alliance has the questionnaire that I mentioned, and the Vendor Security Alliance has the questionnaire as well. So from here, what do I think you should do? Definitely, if you don't have a third-party risk management program, you should think about implementing one. So start work on identifying your third parties. Start work on putting together that inventory or that map of the different third parties that you have, both inside your organization and outside, the access to the information they have, the level of access they have, and whether you have any indication of how well they're protecting the information. In about 3 months, you should have completed your third-party inventory. Have a go at assessing the risk of each relationship. So have a look at that AXI in terms of the value of the information versus the value of the activity that they're performing. Review your third-party risk management process against the key points in this presentation. Get a copy of NIST. Have a look at the control objectives and the measures that they recommend. Do a self-assessment or an audit and determine if there's any gaps that you need to fix. And I'll leave you with the final thought. This is a picture of Warren Buffett, the Oracle of Omaha, one of the richest men in the world and an investment guru. His quote is, "It takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to ruin it. If you think about that, you'll do things differently." And with that, I'll open it up to any questions.
Anyone have any questions?
I guess in practical terms, I can see it's been a great presentation about how to move forward. But as I said, in practical terms, there's probably an awful lot of third-party suppliers in organisations now that are dodgy,
Yes,
to
yes, there
say
will
the
be.
least. Do you have any recommendations about how to just, reel them in quickly without stopping the business? Does it come back to that risk chart that you showed, or is there some other magic?
Well, I mean, there's two ways to handle it. One is to actually get in front of management and try and explain the risk. I have seen organisations actually go back and attempt to insert new clauses into contracts and new requirements post having signed it. The best way to obviously not enter into a dodgy relationship with a dodgy third party is to vet them first before anything gets signed. And that comes to awareness, making sure that the people in your organisation who are empowered to sign contracts actually know that they need to talk to someone first. So that would involve speaking to heads of business units. If you have a procurement function, talking to procurement. So there's no hard or short answer in terms of dealing with that sort of post-contract signing or dealing with some legacy stuff. So before you put in place your process. Often you've just got to highlight the risk to management, feed that into your risk register and follow whatever processes come from that.
What softwares are available for managing the third party? You mentioned it before.
Yeah, so there's a very good software product called Line. It's ALYNE. Now this is a product made by some guys, ex-Deloitte guys based in Germany. And it's a particular product provides a quite comprehensive control list. So you can take controls from ISO, from PCI, from NIST. You can build a questionnaire, and then you can send that questionnaire out via email. It's a cloud system hosted in AWS. The vendor will get their email, they'll log into the system, they'll answer the questions. They can upload supporting documents and supporting information. And then the Alliance system allows you to, where you identify a weakness, you can then take that weakness and create a risk. And from a risk, you can create activities and assign owners, and then track that through to resolution. So that eliminates the emailing and the spreadsheets and provides a system where you can set up some dashboards so that management can look at progress or not progress or some graphs around how things are going. No worries.
Okay, guys, thank you very much. If you can give them a warm welcome. Applause.